Hi, I'm Margie Holmes, psychologist, author, and educator. This week's discussion is about self-harm. For today's episode, we'll focus on common questions about the topic. Let's start with the definition of self-harm. Self-harm is the act of deliberately harming your own body, such as cutting or burning yourself. A common question is, well, what about suicide and self-harm? Does one lead to the other? Generally, no. Self-harm is not a precursor of a suicide attempt. If you will just look, there are many people who self-harm for many, many years, but then a lot of them are not dying, and very few complain about it at all. Now, this is not to minimize the effect of self-harm, okay? This is just to let you know or to show you exactly how difficult it is to connect the two. Actually, I guess what you could say about self-harm that ties up with suicide is that it is a way to deal with intense physical pain, with intense anger and frustration. Okay, what forms of self-harm are there? Well, you have head banging, you have cigarette burning, you have a nose box or bump, you have syringes to draw blood, and you have cutting. We will have more of this next week, okay? Now, Benjamin Cardenas chimes in. Self-harm? When people keep voting for the same fools election after election, isn't that a form of collective masochism? That it is, Benjamin, but it's not really self-harm. But I am so happy you put a little comic relief into this topic. A common question that is also asked is, why do people harm themselves? Well, here are some of what you shared with me. Ren Ina Lavatoria says, sometimes when people are hurting so much, they inflict pain on themselves to deaden the earlier feeling of pain. Yung iba, literal, like cutting themselves kasi they could focus on the physical pain and could temporarily forget the emotional pain. I never did cut myself, but I did bite my hands nung time na ang sama-sama ng loob ko. Some people naman resort to substance abuse, alcohol, or even drugs with the same purpose, to forget the pain temporarily. I know that different people face problems in different ways, and this is the least productive way, short of taking one's own life, of course. Pero siguro nga, when one is feeling so hopeless, or when one is sort of blaming oneself for the pain, albeit unconsciously, siguro doon nagaganap ang self-harm. Thank you very much, Ren. Parang ang galing-galing mong psikologista. I hope you will not be tremendous competition for me. Joke only. Casey shares a story with us. I've started with cutting wrists, but I also found other ways. I found out that if I hit my nose hard enough at the right spot, my nose would bleed nonstop. And it didn't even leave a scar that people would notice. After that, I experimented with huge needles and syringes used for taking blood samples. What these huge needles do is that it leaves a very small wound, in which case other people won't notice, and yet it drains a lot of blood. So much blood, in fact, that I got super dizzy and sometimes couldn't even walk right anymore. It made me so calm and made me just want to go to sleep. When you're sad and hate yourself, I guess this was a welcome feeling for me. It stops you from thinking, and you can just lie down and hear your heartbeat until you sleep. Now, the reasons culled from all that you've shared with me, and thank you by the way, actually coincides with most research on the topic. Number one reason is that the physical pain lessens or distracts from the emotional pain, as you have mentioned above. Number two is a matter of control. One finds out that if you self-harm or threaten your partners or parents that you will self-harm, especially if they've already experienced your doing so, parents tend to give you what you want and partners tend not to leave you. The Arnie Kim Butlay explains this a little further. Maaari ngang kanya-kanyang pamamaraan kung paano malibsan ng tao ang kanyang nararamdaman o saloobin. Anonymous. A third reason is hatred turned inwards. I realize that this is a very Freudian concept. And many people like to think that Freud is laos na. But you know, a lot of times, he is also right. So yes, anger turned inwards could be another reason for self-harm. A fourth reason is that it is something to look forward to in a sea of unrelenting pain. Example, Angelina. When I started cutting to deaden the pain, I got so addicted. It reached the point when the razor waiting for me at home would give me so much comfort. I loved to see the blood and to feel the sting. It meant the ache had been overpowered. Now, there are other reasons, and the fifth, sixth, and seventh reasons I shall share with you next week when we go into the topic more deeply, okay? Now, here are some of your questions on self-harm. Jenny V. Nugudula asks, does self-harm escalate? It can, but not necessarily. Jenny V. Nugudula continues, is this just a manifestation of a bigger problem? Most likely it is, because it is an expression of deep pain, of anger, frustration, and inability to self-soothe, of revenge. Usually, if you repress these feelings and only do it through self-harm, which is not really expressing yourself, then it tends to get worse. But again, not necessarily. Okay? Joanna Puno asks, bakit po yung iba, pag nakakabalita na may nananakit sa sarili, sinusubukan din? Is it because may attention na napupunta sa kanila? Oo, maaaring ganon, pero it could also mean that it is a form of bonding. You know, when you self-harm, you feel so lonely, you feel so alone. So, if you can share this with someone, even in a very tangential way, maybe it helps you soothe your pain more. Maria Sapia, is rough sex considered self-harm? Not really. In fact, it could be considered a whole lot of fun if both people want it. Do some women really enjoy bondage? Yes, some women really, really enjoy bondage. Which is not to say you should do it to every woman. You must always ask permission, right? It can be way before the fact. But, you know, what we always say is, anything is okay between consulting adults, within limits, of course. But the most important is to make sure that the person really consents, that you don't presume, uy, nagpapakipot lang yan, you know, when she really isn't. Okay? Krishaline Abayon asks, is masochism, emotional masochism at that, all bad? Now, if you mean by emotional masochism also sexual masochism, then it is not necessarily all bad. First, if you have consent from both parties, and secondly, of course, if the pain you inflict or get inflicted on you does not cause infection, etc., which could be bad from a purely objective level. However, if you mean emotional masochism, where one or both in a relationship complain all the time about being hurt emotionally and yet never leave, which means that the emotional masochism continues and continues, then yes, it is bad. Bert Kibuyan asks, are those people sick? They obviously need medical attention and counseling. Now, in my clinical experience, medical attention is not really what they need unless under very special circumstances. As I say, if cigarette burning might lead to infection, or they miscalculate the depth or force with which they cut themselves, and then therefore they have to go to an emergency, you know, the emergency room, etc. But on the whole, people cut themselves for years and years, and yet they can get by without any medical attention at all. If they cannot talk to their parents or their boyfriends, especially if they themselves are the cause of the problem, their parents and their boyfriends, then probably the help they need is not a medical doctor, but a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And here's an answer, Bert Kibuyan, from what you said. Angelina Sparks Canapi says, sick people also need loving, accepting family and friends around them. A therapist meets sick people fewer times than the world around the sick people does. I also think this stigma of sick is just too convenient for people who are normal. So in effect, one could say that by definition, lifestyle choices, not eating well, sleeping so late, which by the way is considered bigger cause of accidents than drinking when you're driving. All these lifestyle choices can be considered self-harm. But because they happen so slowly, because the effects are not immediate, in fact, one may even be doing it unconsciously, by definition, they would not be considered self-harm. But maybe this is something we should think about. Alcoholism, anorexia, recreational drugs. Maybe we should just explore the possibility that this might be self-harm, because in that sense, maybe people will be more careful about their lifestyle choices. Okay, that's it for today. Next time or next week, we will delve into the topic of self-harm more deeply, focusing on those who cut themselves and also the possible ways to stop it. Now, tell us what you'd like to discuss next on Ask Margie. Send in your questions and comments and suggestions on Facebook, tweet using the hashtag AskMargie, or send an email to askmargie@rappler.com. See you next week.